On almost every front, coffee seems to be healthy and have a really positive impact wherever it's been measured and across a whole range of different stuff. So, as to why caffeine's one part of it, I think the fact that coffee contains a surprising amount of fiber is another one, or the quantity of polyphenols in there. If you're interested in the gut microbiome, like coffee seems to be really good for that. And I think we know more and more the microbiome. Tim Spector has taught us all the importance of that it impacts us in so many different ways. So on almost any front, if you've researched, is coffee good for, longevity? Yes, you see a reduction in all-cause mortality that correlates to coffee consumption. Is it good for cognitive decline? Yes, you tend to see coffee consumption associated with less cognitive decline in old age, or liver function, cancer. All of these things seem to have a positive association with coffee drinking, but if it's messing with your sleep, I don't think it's worth it. That's just me. That's the line for me of like, it's not such an incredible benefit that it is worth the loss of sleep quality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sleep has become just the most sort of the biggest obsession in my life over the last year.
I think for all of us. I think it's just, if you pay attention to this stuff, you can't help but begin to obsess over it. I hope healthily.
Yeah. So to avoid the impact of coffee impacting on sleep, you think the best thing to do is, because I've just not been drinking coffee after like 1 p.m.
Great.
Okay.
I think that's a pretty good way to go. I think decaf is still a good option. I think people are kind of really negative about decaf because we have this caffeine first association with coffee. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are like, why would I drink decaf? What's the point? Mm-hmm. You see a lot of death before decaf or whatever. But I think decaf can be really tasty, which is good. Like, it's a nice, delicious hot drink. And also, there's a little bit less of the downside if you are concerned about caffeine.
I'm so you and Tim Spector are the two people that have made the case. I think the first time I spoke to Tim Spector about coffee, he was a little bit on the fence as to whether it was healthy or not. He came back a second time, and I think there's been a little bit of a shift in him. He's now pro coffee in terms of the gut microbiome, which I thought was super interesting. He says it counts as one of my 30 fruit and vegetables a week that I need to get, which was really surprising. So it helped my gut microbiome. He talked about the longevity impacts as well, which I thought was staggering, that the studies seem to show that it will extend your life. Yeah,
it's a reduction in all-cause mortality. So you're just less likely to die early, I suppose, is the easiest way to think about it. Or that's what we see from the studies. And it's not that the studies aren't without flaws, but there's been a lot now, and you tend to see people dying less often or less early when they drink more coffee. Not a huge amount of coffee. And this is if you ever go into the research, this is really important. A cup of coffee to you or me might look like this. A cup of coffee to a researcher is 120 mils of coffee, which is about half of this. So you'll see loads of studies say 3 cups of coffee is when you see these benefits. That's not a liter of coffee. That's more like 300 to 400 mils total a day of, say, filter coffee, or 1 or 2 or 3 espressos, single espressos. So the definition of a cup from all these studies is really confusing and problematic, and I think encourages excess coffee consumption. But 3 cups of coffee for heart disease, for all sorts of things, is seen to be associated with improvement in outcome.
Why might that be? What is it about the coffee bean, that is causing health benefits? That's
probably above my pay grade. Mm-hmm. I would probably, at this point, I'm probably aligned with Tim in that it's a great source of fiber and polyphenols. That it is like having another vegetable into the diet. It's more diversity of diet. I think one study showed that for some people in the US, like, cups of filter coffee were their primary source of dietary fiber. Now, that's kind of wild and not really how things should be, but it is a significant source of fiber if you think about it that way. A large cup might be 3 grams of fiber, which doesn't seem like much until you start tracking your fiber intake and you realize, oh, that's a decent contribution for a drink. I think that's the biggest part of it. I don't think caffeine has been shown to be neuroprotective necessarily. So I think people are trying to understand the mechanism more. Caffeine's been studied separately and is much easier to study because you can dose it, you can look at the effects of that. To really do a study on coffee consumption is really hard. You can't really do a randomized controlled trial where you raise people from, say, 15 to 60 years old, you control their diet, exercise, sleep, and you just randomize the coffee consumption, because then you might see something that you could really say coffee is good or bad. We can just look at these large epidemiological studies and say, well, trying to control for diet and exercise and cigarettes and all these other things, it looks like coffee drinkers survive longer or have less issues. And it might just be that healthy people are just attracted to coffee. We don't really know which way around that is. There's no strong mechanism. But at this point, I'd probably be aligned with Tim on this one, that I think it's primarily going to be the gut.
The fiber point's super interesting because he said to me that we're like, as a society, extremely fiber deficient.
Yes.
I think the number he said that we needed was about 20 grams of fiber a day.
I think so, yeah.
So if coffee's giving us 3 or 4 of those grams, that's almost sort of 25% of our requirement, which is pretty staggering. And I never really thought of coffee as a source of fiber.
Neither did I until he told me. It just didn't cross my mind that this, it's a drink. It's not like a thick.
Yeah.
I lived the life of like fiber is miserable cardboardy brown cereal.
Yeah.
That's fiber in my brain, and the idea that this was fiber was inconceivable to me. But then I read the studies, and it was fascinating.
What about mental health? I've always wondered, even things like depression, anxiety. I've always assumed a little bit that coffee, because of the caffeine, is going to be bad for anxiety.
I would certainly say, not a doctor, but I would certainly say that if someone suffers with anxiety, cutting out caffeine would be something to test and to see if there's benefits to cutting caffeine out. There are a bunch of studies done on it. They're not uniform in their outcome. Some found different results for caffeine consumption. And I think because you're trying to study what is ultimately quite a generic term that covers a lot of different experiences and challenges that people face. So yeah, I wouldn't say consume it regardless, don't think about it. I think if you struggle with anxiety, it would certainly be worth considering cutting it out.
What about depression?
I think the same sort of thing is true there. I think there have been studies that correlate caffeine consumption to depression. I think there are people who have used it and have found benefit from it. Again, it's one of those ones where I just wouldn't blindly consume caffeine assuming a benefit to mental health. If I have mental health challenges, I think it's a place to check, and it's pretty easy to check. Cut it out for a month. It'll suck for a few days, but you may see benefits or you may not. But
another sort of complicated, tenuous link has been made towards cancer with coffee.
Mm-hmm. Most of the meta studies now seem to come down on, for almost every cancer, there's a lower incidence associated with coffee consumption. That's not universal. Some studies have found differently. Again, they're just really hard studies to do effectively, I think. I think that's the challenge of it. I have certainly not seen anything that makes me concerned about drinking coffee from that perspective anyway. I think there's whatever impact it may have, I think would be pretty minor compared to something like cigarettes. And I remember, I think you said on the internet some time ago, you think in 10 or 20 years' time, people will see coffee consumption the way they see cigarette consumption.
Yeah, I did. I remember saying that 2 years ago.
Yeah. And I think to some extent, there's something in that. I think we are getting more thoughtful about caffeine consumption. And I think caffeine is going to be the root of it all rather than coffee as a whole.
Yeah, that's what I should have said. I should have said caffeine.
And I think there is change. And I think, we're definitely seeing that. I think there's enough health benefits in the coffee itself that we would benefit from keeping it around. I don't think there's any health benefits associated with cigarette smoking, but I think coffee will have some benefits, but I think our attitude and our relationship with caffeine is going to change. I think you're right about that.
Yeah, that's really what I was getting at. I almost couldn't pull apart coffee from caffeine because I'm a muggle on this subject matter. But what I really mean is that addiction to this drug of caffeine and how it's like running everyone's life, and we need 3 cups or 4 cups a day just to be normal and to show up to work and think straight. I go, Jesus Christ, like, as is always the case with these sort of health revolutions, we kind of go to one extreme, then we go to the other. There's the counter movement. There'll be like the big decaf movement. There's now, because of neurodiversity and anxiety concerns, there's this jitter-free, crash-free caffeine movement emerging in things like matcha and etc. So, is decaf? Are you seeing a rise in people choosing decaf? And
the great frustration of decaf is that decaf drinkers are typically very poorly served by the coffee industry.
Okay.
For a bunch of reasons, coffee shop owners tend not to invest in decaf. A lot of coffee roasting companies don't really care about decaf, despite the fact that decaf drinkers are the ones who are drinking it just for the taste. They are the purest coffee consumer, actually, because they just want the flavor. They don't even want the caffeine, just the flavor.
Madness.
So, it's always been an important thing for me over the years that decaf be good. But, Yeah, I'd love to see more decaf consumption going on. I think decaf can be really delicious and good if it's done properly all the way through from sort of farm to cup. But it's not as available as it should be to most people, which kind of hurts me.
What about Alzheimer's? Randomly something I've got increasingly more interested in over the last couple of years. I think from doing this podcast and speaking to health experts, but it has almost felt like this mystery disease that strikes some people for a reason that we haven't quite yet figured out. Perfectly healthy people can suddenly get the news that they have Alzheimer's. Is there a relationship from the studies that you've seen between Alzheimer's and coffee?
Yes. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, where you see, once again, up to about 3 cups of coffee a day saw an association with reduced cognitive decline and reduced incidence of Alzheimer's. So it's, again, I'm not saying that coffee is causing this. I'm saying in the studies, the people who drank coffee had better outcomes. But you can't just say because they drank coffee. That's a really important disconnect in these kind of things that doesn't happen often enough.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.